Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for being here. Bruce remembers what I wrote much better than I do. I had forgotten about these things, and some of the descriptions he gives of what I wrote are far more interesting. I would love to read them. I want to, of course, thanks Bruce. He didn't say that he and I met when we were students, and we were tortured at the same time by our faculty. And you develop very strong bonds when you are in the same cubicle hating the professors that are, so I am a dear friend of Bruce, and I'm grateful to be here. I'm also aware that I'm here thanks to the vision and generosity of Stanley Kleon. I know that his wife and daughter are here. He was the early visionary that understood the importance of bringing conversations about ethics into business schools, and the importance of injecting these kinds of reflections whenever that it was not only cash flows and discounted cash flows, and the asset pricing model is the capital asset pricing model is not everything, that other things needed to be included. And so I am here thanks to that, and thanks to Columbia University. I was also told that rather than a long, boring lecture, I should try to give a short, non-boring one. And that means to have as much time as possible for a conversation and an exchange with you. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm just going to lay out some thoughts and ideas, and then hopefully we can then exchange views and talk about these issues. I am going to make several bold assertions. The first is that the frontiers of globalizations are defined by illicit networks. The frontiers, so if you really want to know how the world is connected and how very remote places in the mountains of Afghanistan are connected to Manhattan, or how very remote little towns that are manufacturing towns in China are connected to the international markets for counterfeits, Prada bags, toys, or electronics, you better look at the illicit traders that are faster than anyone else in detecting opportunities, that have the resources, the mobility, the logistics, the infrastructure, the money, the political contacts, the power to really make these things happen. If we do a business case study here, and I ask you, let's develop a business plan to set up an exporting operation out of Kandahar. Would you, let's develop that, and we're going to export things. Would you invest with me? Well, we would go, and you entrepreneurial business school students that you are, you would go and do the due diligence and look for details and look at and then discover that it's impossible. That you would not invest in a business venture in Kandahar or in some places in Bolivia. Yet, there are entrepreneurs that every day make billions, not billions, that every year make billions of dollars in sales around the world, exporting from places like Kandahar that are unreachable, dangerous, not well connected in a formal way, but splendidly and very effectively connected in very informal, very powerful, efficient ways. These are of course, I'm talking about the traders, the producer and exporters and distributors of drugs. But you would not be able to run a legal business on any other commodity out of these places. This begins to give you a flavor of the sort of ideas that I think need to be factored into conversations about globalization. So the first assertion is you really want to understand who is at the frontiers of the global integration, the way in which markets and peoples and politics and technology and culture are being tied together and by commerce and other forces. Look at the illicit traders, not just of drugs, but of people, human organs, weapons, drugs, and counterfeited products of all kinds. this means, and this brings me to the point of today's conversation about ethics. The contours, the frontiers of some of the thorniest ethical dilemmas facing humanity today are also found in the spaces where illicit trades intersect with our daily lives, with politics, and with finance, and with commerce, and with war, and with poverty, and with inequality, and with the way in which some countries try to integrate with others and in complex ways. So a lot of the very difficult challenges facing humanity are at the center of these illicit trades. And therefore, if you dissect them, if you you know, I always smile when I hear people talking about corporate social responsibility, which has become, of course, a very important issue. You know, corporations that have to become corporate citizens, good corporate citizens that should not, you know, pay bribes and should not stain, you know, not dirt the environment and so on. Yet, some of the largest business operations in the world today do not have corporate social responsibility because they're criminal enterprises. And that begins also to start showing some of the contradictions in which we are going to be living. But again, understanding the anatomy of these trades, how they work, what they are, how they colonize and influence and shape aspects of where we live, and how we live, and how we trade, and how we do politics. It's very important, and it's very interesting to look at those issues from this angle, which is a very improbable, different way of looking at this. I will, my fourth final bold assertion is that this trend, the trend in which whereby illicit traders are growing and touching everyone and everything, is far more important as a defining trend of our time than terrorism. Illicit trades are more important than terrorism. If I ask you, how many of you have been directly touched by terrorism? Please raise your hands. 1, 2. How many of you have been touched by some kind of illicit trade? I ask that questions everywhere I go around the world, and the people, individuals that have been touched, unless you count, of course, making long lines in airports. But if you exclude that, then that is a way in which terrorism has touched us all. But if you go around the world and ask, have you been influenced, touched directly? Has your life been affected by terrorism? Very few people. Very few people. If you go around and say, have you been in touch or have you had anything to do with an illegal worker? Have you had friends or acquaintances? Have you seen drugs, narcotics? And so on. Have you ever bought a fake Rolex? Or a counterfeited Gucci bag or scarf? So that gives you a sense of the proportion, the volumes, the growth of these things. The added complication is that I have now been studying this for more than a decade. And I have looked at this in different countries, in all continents, in all trades. And I can tell you that I have not found, and I could not give you one example in which governments are succeeding in containing the growth of these trades, let alone stamping them out. I'm not even suggesting that, you know, show me a government around the world that can claim that for all its efforts has been able to eradicate drug trafficking and consumption, or the trafficking in counterfeits, or the trafficking in illicit weapons, or money laundering. Show me. There's not one. Then show me one that has been able to contain the growth of any of these trades. There aren't any. So the illicit traders are winning in this tension between society and its governments, and their and the illicit traders. In order to begin to understand these things, I think there are three illusions that are very dear and deeply ingrained in the way we think about these issues. The first illusion is that there is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new. You know, crime has been with us since time immemorial. You know, crime is part of the human experience. International crime, criminals that move across borders, as old as recorded history. Smuggling, you know, buying something here and moving it along across some line defined by an authority where it has a different price. You can find reports of that in the pyramids. So, smuggling and the internationalization of criminals is nothing new. And therefore, there's, you know, and then the mafia, of course, you know, born in Italy and transported to a few blocks from here, and nothing new. Well, that's an illusion. There is plenty that is new. International crime has changed in very important ways. It has been driven, it has been amplified, it has been transformed, and it has gained unprecedented potency, thanks to globalization, and thanks to technology, and thanks to political changes, cultural changes, and all sorts of things that we can discuss. But we are living at a time in which international criminals have acquired unprecedented powers, influence in our history. And I can elaborate more about that if you want. It includes not only technology when you think about this, but when you think about this, you need to think about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have to think about the ascent of China, the integration of China to the global economy, the ascent of a lot of emerging markets. You have to think about the Great Awakening, whereby now you have millions of people with new rights and new activists. We're living now at a time, and this is a phrase that Brzezinski uses. We are living at a time in which it is easier to kill 100 million people than govern 100 million people. And that brings that element of difficulties in governance, in which governments are constantly facing constraints in their abilities to do things, from access to funds and fiscal constraints to limits on what they can do, and all sorts of constraints are part of an environment that has provided illicit traders with these unprecedented opportunities. So the first illusion is that there is nothing new. The second illusion is that this is about crime. These are criminals, period. And if it's, what do you do if something is criminal? Well, you call the police. This is a matter for the police. And then you call the police and you say, well, it's criminals, just put them to jail. So it's a matter of courts and the police. Well, it is that. We also call it corruption. But as you will see from the way we develop the conversation, this, of course, is corruption, but it's far beyond corruption. And in fact, corruption may be the wrong way to describe it, because corruption evokes the wrong kinds of mental associations. When you hear corruption, you typically think about a government official that is getting a kickback from somebody building a highway or purchasing stuff for the government, which is that. But here we're talking about a completely different ballgame. And one of the phrases that you're going to hear from me that I think it's very important is that we're witnessing, as a byproduct of this growth of illicit trades, we're witnessing a global trend characterized by the politicization of criminals and the criminalization of politicians. By that I mean it is not just, we're not just talking about a crooked government official that looks the other side when a container full of contraband goes by. We're talking about the possibility that the head of that government is the head of that operation. Recently, I was talking to the head of the Bulgarian intelligence service. And he was telling me, you know, it used to be that countries have mafias. In our country, the mafia has a country. And in Eastern Europe and in parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, in the Balkans, that happens to be the case. And we constantly see examples in which top government officials are jailed or captured or caught in cameras as they are, in fact, not just part and passive accomplices and bribe takers, but they are the leaders of the corporation, of the criminal corporation. So this is just to say that we are no longer in Kansas. We're not in Kansas anymore. This is not just about crime. This is far bigger and is going to touch ways in which societies are organized. It's going to touch the politics of countries. In a lot of Latin American countries these days, if you don't have access to monies coming from these illicit traders, you're going to have a very hard time getting elected to anything. The funding of political campaigns in a lot of countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, is now where is the big money? You know, in Afghanistan, if you think that Afghanistan, 90% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan. It is something like 60% of that country's GDP. Who do you think are the tycoons there? Who do you think are the big money people? It's not Goldman Sachs. Okay? These are people involved in the most important economic activity in the country. So if you're going to run an election in Afghanistan and you need to fund posters and rallies and everything else, who do you think you have to go to get the money from? And I'm using Afghanistan, but I could use several other governments. So it's not true that it's nothing new. It is an illusion that this is just about crime. And the other third illusion is that this is what this is something that is underground, that is others do, that is deviant, that is offshore, that is, there are all sorts of phrases and words that give the illusion that this is separated from us. This is what others do. This is what people with low ethics or unethical people, criminals, all sorts of people with deviant behavior do. Well, that is also an illusion. If you think that about 8% of China's GDP is produced by the manufacturing and export of counterfeited products, you're talking of millions of families that depend on their daily, and their well-being and their work on producing something that we think is criminal. If you think of countries in which very large chunks of the economic activity is related to these illicit activities, you're talking about something that is neither underground, nor is deviant, nor is offshore. It is the core, at the core of what that society is. These three illusions, in turn, blur and confuse some of the, what I call the three blurrings that are happening and they're hard to pinpoint but are very important. We have, and you are taught in your daily classes, that there are companies that are legal. They exist to be lawful companies. And the world is divided between lawful legal companies that exist to create good for society and produce goods and services that are sold legally. And then there are a bunch of criminals. It's quite clear here in your classrooms. It's not clear in the rest of the world. It's not black and white. The world is not divided into clean companies and criminal companies. In a lot of places in the world, there is a hybrid. There is a gray zone where you have a complex hybrid that is a mixture of illegal activities with very legal operations. And in fact, a lot of these illegal activities could not exist without the active strategic alliance with legal companies. Then the volumes in terms of tonnage of illicit trade that are moved every year, it does not happen in submarines. Happens using the main trade and freighter routes around the world. The banking system that exists is, and where money is being laundered, does not just happen in some remote island in the Caribbean. It also happened in an island called Manhattan, and it happens in another island called England. In fact, there is a fantastic editorial from the Financial Times that says, well, you know, what is this story about money laundering and clamping down on Nauru, which is an island in the Pacific, which is a money center, is a money laundering heaven, when in the city of London is where you get a lot of the money laundering. And in the city of Manhattan, in the island of Manhattan, is another island paradise for money laundering. And that happens in the same banks where you probably are going to work, already work, or you bank. I'm not suggesting that all of these banks are criminals. I'm just suggesting that that perfect line where the world is divided into black companies with black hats and white companies with white hats is an illusion. There is another blurring, which is the blurring that occurs with companies that try to influence governments. It goes without saying that if you're running a company and the bottom line of your company is highly dependent on decisions made by governments, you are going to find ways to influence those decisions. In some countries that is called corruption, in other countries it's called lobbying. But it happens everywhere. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, or if you run a telecommunications company, or if you run a university, that your performance, your financial performance, is related to some decisions that some regulators will make. And that applies to a lot of sectors. So in every single sector where your bottom line is driven or is greatly impacted by regulatory decisions, that company uses part of its proceeds, parts of its revenues to influence that government. It's automatic, it's accepted, it's part of how the world works. So if that's true for all companies that are affected by regulators, imagine how much more valid it is for companies whose life depends on the benevolence of governments, or governments closing an eye to what they do, or governments allowing their existence. So if you're an illicit trader of weapons, or counterfeits, or drugs, or human organs, or endangered fauna or flora, you need to be very close to governments. You cannot afford it. You cannot survive if you are not in cahoots with governments. And again, the volumes we're talking about, both physical volumes and financial volumes, are of such scale and such continuity over time. This is not a one-off deal. These are deals that happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days per year. They are constant in great volumes and with a lot of money and great tonnage. If that is the case, you don't simply deal with the poor guy that happens to be at customs that afternoon when your container is going through. You have to own the customs. That means, and that brings me to, you know, if all regulated companies use part of the revenues to influence regulators, then illicit traders have to spend massively to control the governments and the politics. Therein, the politicization of crime and the criminalization of politics. Because the next thing that happens is that the people that run the country discover that they could run the illegal trades too, and that they better get in partnership with the illegal traders. The third behavior, note that I'm talking about three kinds of behavior that are very common in the private sector. They're part of the strategies that any private enterprise would use. The first I mentioned, the blurring of the line between legal and illegal. And that is just a reflection of the natural behavior of any company, which is risk diversification. You have to diversify risk, right? So if you are into a high risk, high yield business like trading in human organs, and you are making a lot of money, you will have a strong incentive to diversify into a lower risk and lower return activity. Or if you are into drug trafficking and you get huge returns, at some point you're going to use the proceeds. You have the money, you have to diversify, so you end up buying a construction company. Or, you know, if you are the mafia, you end up doing garbage collection or casinos, or you diversify. And therein lies the hybrids that I was talking about. So the first blurring is driven by the need to diversify. The second blurring is driven by the need to influence regulators. So big companies that make a lot of money do two things. They diversify and they try to influence regulators to lower the impact. What is a third thing that large companies do to legitimize their existence, and they are very actively involved in society? They are philanthropists. They give money away, corporate social responsibility. So they pay for orchestras and social entrepreneurs and good works and poverty alleviation and fight climate change and protect human rights and fund soccer clubs. That's what criminals are doing too. Why not? Remember, you may not remember, but when Pablo Escobar Gaviria, which is one of the original visionaries of these trades, he was one of the first Colombians that in their 70s and 90s and 80s discovered that he could go global with the trade in drugs. And he was one of the big innovators in these things. He developed new distribution channels. He developed new packaging systems. He developed new agricultural systems, new financing mechanisms, new connections with the markets. He was truly, you know, he should have a room in this building as an innovator. But he was the biggest criminal. He was an assassin. He killed people randomly. He would blow planes out of the sky, and so on. At one point, he offered to buy and repay Colombia's external debt. And he was from a city called Medellin. And he was the main provider of philanthropic services in Medellin. He owned the soccer club. He owned all sorts of social services. So if you lived in Medellin at the time, it was very likely that the medicines and health units and the schools and the soccer club and so on would be funded by Pablo Escobar Gaviria. And he was a pioneer on that, but you know, he has other followers in Russia. Many of the Russian oligarchs, as you know, are now the owners of many of the big sport franchises. When Romania was trying to get accepted to be a member of the European Union, one of the conditions for the Romanian authorities was that they had to jail one of the biggest criminals, and who happened to be the owner of the Romanian International Soccer Club. And the Romanians simply couldn't do it. And so they had to negotiate it and find ways, and, but he was a very important player in that arena. And it's the same everywhere. In the favelas of Brazil, of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, very often the state does not have a presence. So if you live in a favela, in these very poor neighborhood barrios in Sao Paulo, Rio, the people that control your neighborhood, the people that also provide safety and provide schooling and even sports activity and, of course, health, are the people that control the drug trade in that barrio, in that favela. And why? Because that's the way to develop even deeper, they're deeply ingrained in the fabric of that community. So the three blurrings are, and so, you know, all philanthropists are not philanthropists. And not all companies are, you know, the three blurrings are, again, driven by diversification and influencing regulators and trying to buy. When large companies become large philanthropists, there's always behind it some business strategy, and there's business justification. You know, you want to gain legitimacy, social acceptance. It's part of your branding strategy. And it's the same with these illicit networks. They build brands, and they build access, and they build legitimacy, and they build deep connections with the communities in which they work, and that provides protection in very important, interesting ways. This, of course, creates a plethora of challenges for society. First, the obvious question is what to do and how to develop initiatives that contain the growth of these activities. But before even thinking about what to do, we need to think about what are we doing already, and what are the ways in which society is trying to battle and combat these trades. So think about this. One of the ways in which society, this country, for example, is penalizing one of the activities, or two of the big activities, is in trying to curb the international trade in narcotics, the importation and distribution of narcotics, and of people. So if you're caught in the border between the United States and Mexico, between Mexico and the United States, you are caught with a kilo of cocaine, or you are caught with trying to smuggle an illegal alien. Which of the two crimes will take you to jail longer? Which one should take you longer, and which one do you think ends up taking you for a longer time in jail? Cocaine. If there is, if you just walk a few blocks from here and just stroll the cities of Manhattan, and you stop and buy from one of the many peddlers there, you buy a Gucci bag. What risks are you running? Do you feel at risk? Do you feel you're running any risk? Do you feel you can go to jail for that? Do you feel that you're committing a crime? No. Most people that do that don't feel they're committing a crime. Now, what do you think can happen to the person that is selling you that bag? That person is probably an illegal alien. He is as illicit as the stuff he's selling, and he is under constant threat by the law. But he's there because of the people that are buying. He would not be there if he didn't have a very large market that feels absolutely comfortable buying and wearing and flaunting fake watches or bags or whatever. So you graduate from here, you get married, you have a very busy life. You have plenty of things to do, places to go, new positions to acquire, and the two of you, you and your couple, have children. Someone needs to take care of the children. So you will hire, probably, an illegal alien. That is probably a woman from Central America, or Mexico, that has abandoned their family Not because she doesn't love them, but because she needs to put food on the table. So she probably has babies the same age of the baby she's taking care of. She goes through a harrowing journey where she's probably raped, she's probably robbed, she's probably abused, beaten up from multiple trucks and multiple shelters and so on, until she ends up in Manhattan, working for you. She's a criminal. If the police catch her, she will go to jail and then extradited. If you are caught, nothing happens to you. There are no penalties. There are penalties, but rarely. Do you know anyone that has been, other than people that want to work in government and don't pay taxes for their legal work? Other than that, do you know anyone? Do you have any acquaintance that has had any brush with the law for the fact of having a nanny that is an illegal worker? You don't. But every day there are hundreds of these women and men that are rounded up and then sent back to their countries. And they're treated like criminals. Anything more horrible than trafficking in organs? That is one of the most fastest growing trades in the illicit world. Why? Because of technology. There's new technologies. It used to be that having a kidney transplant was very dangerous. Mortality rates were very high, or a liver transplant. Now, you don't hear that much. The mortality rates for these kinds of transplants, or for corneas, are just very low. The other thing that new technologies have produced is the ability to store the merchandise. By that I mean that it used to be that if you had one of these organs, the time in which you could use it was very short. You had to get the thing and move it quickly. Now there are technologies that allow you to store. You can have somewhat of an inventory. If you have an inventory, that means that you can move it long distances. And there are people that are willing to sell you a kidney or a cornea. Some of them do it voluntarily, some of them not. So that should be banned, right? That trade should not exist. Or should it? It is very easy to take the moral high ground where I'm not talking about you. But if I tell you your daughter, your 5-year-old beautiful daughter is going to die, unless we find the liver, a new liver for her. And that liver will save her life, but if you do it legally, it's going to take longer, and she's going to die. Unless I have an option for you, we can take her to Thailand, where American-trained doctors, this is the way it is you can look it up in the web, they advertise. This is American-trained doctors in Thailand or in India or in South Africa will give you a transplant and save the life of your daughter, of your beautiful 5-year-old daughter is going to die. Take the moral high ground there. Illicit trades are at the center of some of the thorniest problems facing humanity. And I have just given you a few examples, but I can give you 100 examples. And this just goes to show that this is an arena that is, because of the three illusions, it's nothing new and it has to do with crime and it's not sufficiently recognized as one of the important trends of our time. And therefore, we have not developed a narrative. We have not developed a conversation that will allow us to tackle it. I believe that these kinds of issues are now where climate change was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, climate change was controversial, you know, and it was an issue, but not really at the center of the political debate. And it became so. Now, for a variety of reasons that go from Al Gore to Katrina to actually the feeling that, the general feeling that things are changing, but mostly about the science. We now have science and data that we didn't have 5 years ago that make it very hard to be a skeptic about these things, even if you're a scientist. And therefore, today, climate change is part of the national conversation, indeed the global conversation, in ways that it was not there 5 years ago. I believe that 5 years from now, these issues and the illegal trades and what to do about them will become part of the general conversation. And issues like the one we have discussed and the one that I hope we can discuss now will become far more common. Thank you very much.